experiences like abuse, assault, or witnessing violence or tragedy can leave people feeling constantly on edge. And PTSD can impact your emotions, your stability, your relationships, right? Trauma can also have an impact on physical and mental health. And these are really common experiences for many people. And they're due in part to 4 ways that your brain changes after experiencing trauma. But the good news is that when you understand how trauma impacts the brain, these symptoms can often be reversed. You can learn to heal.
We're exposed to trauma and how our body reacts to it. Um, I'm going to mostly focus on the trauma that the surviving roommates may have faced after the traumatic event, and how, if we're exposed to a lot of trauma in our lives, what may happen to our bodies and how our body changes, and how we might even become bonded to the trauma that occurs with us. So this is going to show you a little bit about how, oh lovely, how certain things happen whenever we're exposed to trauma, and how the events in our lives correspond to the trauma in our lives. Um, Everything that's stated here is by educated and researched knowledge. The hypotheses that are stated in this video are researched, and they've been proven through studies or literature that shows you about the situation. So,
Okay, so quick review. When you experience something threatening or dangerous, or just witness something happening to someone else, your brain activates the fight, flight, freeze response, essentially the survival mode in the reptile part of your brain. This response helps keep you safe. It shuts down thinking. It releases a surge of hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and it sends blood to the big muscles so you can fight or run away. This gets your heart pounding, it speeds up your breathing, and all of this is so that you're prepared to take physical action to stay safe. And then after the threat has passed, your nervous system should go back into restorative mode, the rest and digest mode. But with PTSD, something interferes with your ability to feel safe. Your brain and your body stay stuck in this mode. So even when you're safe, your brain and your body stay tense. They're on high alert. And you don't ever or don't often revert back to that restorative mode. So, when trapped in a constant trauma response, people with PTSD experience 4 types of difficult symptoms. These include painful thoughts, which is like upsetting memories, flashbacks, and memory loss. Intense emotions, feeling helpless, anxious, ashamed, scared, jumpy, angry, feeling blame or persistent negativity, or just feeling numb. Um, Bodily changes, so these include increased heart rate, feeling jittery or on edge, startling easily, unexpected rage or tears, short and shallow breathing, panic attacks, insomnia, or nightmares. And then the 4th category of symptoms is behavioral changes. So this is usually avoidance of anything related to the trauma or its memories. Now,
the brain.
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
Don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. I know we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze.
Trauma, your brain changes on a physical level. Now, this isn't simply damage, as people would perhaps think, but it's your brain adapting to the experience that the world isn't safe. And in my opinion, it's your brain taking measures to help you avoid future dangers. So essentially, your brain makes you more danger avoidant. Your brain is super moldable. It adapts and it rewires depending on what we experience and how we use our brain. So when we experience trauma, here are 4 ways that the brain changes or adapts after that experience. So first, the amygdala. This is an area of the brain that scans for threats and it connects memories and emotions. So this is kind of like the smoke alarm of the brain. And after trauma, it becomes much more active. It becomes much more sensitive and more likely to alert, to turn on that alarm when it perceives a threat. Survivors become less tolerant of stress, and little things make them feel more anxious. So common things like loud noises, people entering a room from behind, or seeing someone who reminds them of an aggressor, these can all trigger that threat response, even when the loud noise is just fireworks, or when that person with a beard is actually just a waiter, right? I've had clients who felt triggered by grasshoppers or radiators, and both of these things are actually safe, but the amygdala associates them with trauma and then sets off that red alert. So to summarize, with PTSD, the amygdala becomes more sensitive. Okay, second, brain scans indicate that after trauma, the hippocampus shrinks. So the hippocampus is the part of the brain that processes emotions and memories. After trauma, stress hormones essentially kill off cells in the hippocampus, making it less effective at processing emotions. This also makes it hard for the brain to distinguish between the past and the present. So this is essentially what a flashback is. It's your brain experiencing a memory that feels like it's happening right now. People who've experienced trauma, they may have missing memories, fragmented memories, or painful memories that pop up when they don't want them. And when these memories pop up, they re-trigger the amygdala. So essentially, the amygdala perceives the memories as a new threat and sends off, that alarm that restarts that trauma cycle, that whole flooding of the fight, flight, freeze response, and all those physical changes and the stress hormones and all of that. Now,
when it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm...
Okay, let's talk about that one for a second. Do you remember in the PCA where it spoke about Dylan opening the door for the 3rd time and seeing in a man 6 foot or taller wearing a mask with bushy eyebrows? And she stood there in the doorway as he walked by in a frozen shock state. Did you see the last one on there? It says freeze. Many people don't believe that statement. Whenever they come to danger, you have two responses that we often talk about, fight or flight, but very seldom do we talk about freezing. Freezing being in shock, being fearful, and not realizing basically what's going on. So we just freeze until we get our wits about us to run. Because when it comes to danger, most people are just not going to sit there and fight, especially if they believe that they can't overpower the situation. So think about that a minute. To see something of that nature, to hear what she heard, and then later on to understand the concept that while everything was going on, she finally put it together the next day. And how traumatic that must have been based on the sights, what she heard, and how she responded to it or could have responded to it. And by seeing her roommates in that state the next day, how that signaled another danger going off in her brain. So, how did she react then?
Contribute to short-term memory loss. But the connection between the hippocampus and the amygdala gets stronger. Like these two love talking to each other now. And so essentially this maintains that fear response over time. Even if you can't remember the traumatic event, your smoke alarm is still going to blare with the slightest trigger. Okay, number 3, the prefrontal cortex shrinks. So this is the part of the brain that essentially handles higher order thinking and planning, rational thought and language, things like that. This part of the brain becomes disrupted by constantly reverting back to that fight, flight, freeze part of the brain, or the reptile part of the brain. So when you're stuck in fight, flight, freeze, or hypervigilance, the thinking part of the brain gets turned down. And the way that neuroplasticity works is the more we use a part of the brain, the more it grows pathways there. But the less we use a part of the brain, those pathways gets trimmed. So when we can't use reason to think through our traumatic memories or sensations, then it makes it hard for us to override that danger signal that the amygdala and hippocampus are sending. And it makes it harder to remind ourselves that the danger is not real. So because that prefrontal cortex has shrunk a little bit, it makes it harder to process through those memories. It makes it harder to speak about what happened. It makes it harder to think clearly and rationally. And you can see how a person can get trapped in a loop of trauma if they don't get treatment. So these symptoms just make it harder and harder to escape the cycle of PTSD. Okay, number 4, the last way your brain is impacted is really through the broader nervous system. So this constant flooding with stress hormones keeps the body locked in an activated sympathetic state, or the fight, flight, freeze state. It's also known as hyperarousal. So you feel constantly on edge, you feel jittery, you feel stressed out until you get exhausted. Then you have adrenal fatigue, right? You shut down and you feel depressed. So being stuck in this state of an overactive, dysregulated nervous system leads to a lot of strain on the body. And that can contribute to chronic illnesses like autoimmune disorders, low functioning of the immune system, diabetes, obesity, muscle tension, chronic pain, and problems with like sleep and the gut and your heart health. So those are the 4 ways that trauma impacts your brain and nervous system in general. But just like how your brain changed in response to trauma, it can heal too, and this is called neuroplasticity. So your brain adapted the trauma response as a functional way to deal with real threats and dangers. Your brain's not out to get you, but it also has a built-in ability to change in response to healing and perceived safety. So the amygdala can learn to chill out. The hippocampus can relearn to process emotions, and your nervous system can strengthen its ability to revert back to that parasympathetic or that rest and digest response. We can target these structures in the brain and in the body through cognitive work and through body-based work. So a couple of the ways that we can do this are through yoga, mindfulness, writing exercises. So just think of this, right? You're having a trauma response, you're having these big, intense emotions, and you sit down and you make yourself write about it. That's turning on the prefrontal cortex. That's clarifying that in the present moment you are safe. It's helping your hippocampus process through memories. And that sends a message to your amygdala that you're actually safe, right? So something as simple as a writing exercise can help rewire your brain from that trauma. Okay, more types of treatments include CBT, EMDR, somatic experience. These are all treatments that help your brain and body rewire and restore your inner sense of safety and clarity. Now, there's a lot of studies out there that show that your brain can rewire like this, but here, let me give you one example. Research using MRI scans of the brain show that mindfulness practice is correlated with growth in the hippocampus and shrinking of the amygdala. So essentially, it reverses the effects of trauma. I teach a bunch of these skills on my channel, so check out my Healing Trauma playlist if you'd like to learn more, or you could check out my free course, Grounding Skills for Anxiety and Trauma. The link's in the description below. And
Alarm goes off. Blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles. Adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the three parts of the brain working.
Okay, let's stop right there for a second. This kind of goes into the generalized examples that you may have heard in life about a mother having her kids trapped in the car or trapped under the car, where she has minuscule seconds to lift the car and protect her children. She has superhuman strength and she's able to lift the car and get the kids out. Or maybe locked in the cars where she only has a couple minutes and she has that superhuman strength to maybe rip the door off the hinges or rip the door open where she can get her children out. And then afterwards, she's completely spent and exhausted. I talked in my last video or the video before about what it said about the blood going from the muscle to the muscle areas to get what it's needed, the strength to protect the body from the danger. The same thing happens whenever you're exposed with some kind of invading chemical, whether it be drugs, alcohol, that the body does not respond to well and it views it as a toxin. It does the same thing trying to get it out. All this is trauma. All this is trauma to the brain, to the body, to your existence. So let's continue on.
Working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being lost in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression. Crying a lot.
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares. Flashbacks.
Stress.
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatized person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean in practice, in your job? A traumatized person.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So let's hypothesize the surviving roommates and the trauma that they've had to experience after the quadruple murder. The one that saw the perpetrator will probably have the most trauma based on the fact that what she heard, what she saw, what she felt, and how she dealt with it. There's probably a lot of guilt and shame there. And the other one, probably the same thing, just not as intense due to the fact that if she did hear something, it hasn't been stated. If she saw anything, it hasn't really been stated with any kind of real receipts. So the other one could have guilt and shame. The one that saw the perpetrator could have PTSD and flashbacks, as it's stated in this video, just because she's been seen in photos laughing and having a good time as it appears, does not mean that internally her body's not shut down. How her body's not internally suffering from triggers that could, you be in a good mood one moment and you're triggered by something, and all of a sudden you go back into your shell to protect yourself from the moment occurring again. Think of it like this. Have you ever had a stressful day? And you get on the phone first thing in the morning after the first stressor occurs and you recall it to somebody. Let's say you almost got sideswiped. You call your significant other and you're talking about nearly getting sideswiped. Automatically your body goes into fight or flight because it doesn't know the difference between reality and reenactment. So then you get to the office and you tell your coworkers the same story. You get amped up again, your body goes into fight or flight as you're recanting the moment, and then as you're coming down, it's 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 releasing the cortisol.
Signals from our environment are most often first detected by the brain. When someone is frightened, a stress response is initiated by their reaction to an environmental signal. But many signals don't stop here. A signal received by the brain can be passed on to many types of cells throughout the body and have widespread effects. Signals get sent around the body by traveling through the nervous system or bloodstream, going from cell to cell. You could think of the cell's sole purpose in life as keeping signals going or initiating new ones in response to the environment. Once a signaling molecule from the bloodstream reaches a cell and docks, the signal is passed into the cell. Like a miniature mousetrap game, the cell is filled with complex contraptions called proteins that bump and nudge each other to keep the signal going until it reaches its target. In this case, it's the production of yet another signaling molecule that will get released into the bloodstream, dock on other cell types, and cause them to react in a variety of ways. The signal-passing machinery inside the cell can look and work very differently, depending on the intended effect. Here we see a signaling cascade that results in the release of energy molecules. Once liberated, they are sent on their way via the bloodstream to power cells in another area of the body. When this tiny domino effect is triggered inside cells, some amazing things can happen. Other signaling cascades triggered during the stress response result in a variety of physical reactions. This signaling molecule can relax or contract different types of muscle cells. When it reaches the skin, the signal docks on muscle cells attached to a body hair. The tiny muscle is stimulated to contract, raising the hair. The signal also docks on cells wrapped around a sweat gland, which contract too, squeezing sweat onto the skin's surface. In the lungs, the signaling molecule docks on muscle cells wrapped around bronchioles. But these cells relax instead of contract to allow more oxygen into the blood. Because the protein machinery inside each kind of muscle cell is different, this single type of signaling molecule can cause both relaxation and contraction. Many signaling molecules work this way. When this signal reaches the heart, it docks on beating heart cells. Their response is to beat faster. Blood pressure goes up, and the signaling molecule is rushed on to still more cell types around the body. Constantly and in concert, cells must send and receive a myriad of signals. Cell communication is vital to keeping the body alive.
You call your mother calls you, or somebody, your husband, whoever. Bump into a friend, you tell them what happened. The third time you've recanted this story, and the third time your body's going into adrenaline dump, fight or flight, fear, anxiety, and then it crashes the cortisol dump. By the end of the day, however many times you've told this story to people, you're exhausted. You're wiped out. So imagine if you're one of these individuals that lives by chaos and drama all day long. You're having the adrenaline flight or fight, or as it says, freeze, and then you have the cortisol dump. So there's a reason why the cortisol in the midsection gathers, because that's a soothing, calming enzyme released to keep you calm. So if you live by stress or you have a stressful job or stressful relationship or a stressful interaction with life is just so stressful you can't seem to assimilate it in any kind of healthy way. You're living this fight or flight on a daily basis. So think about Dylan and her interpretation with what she saw. She may still be periodically having the post traumatic stress from it. If it was that intense for her, I'm not talking for her, but if she's getting therapy, it may be helping with some of this. But if somebody doesn't get the needed help for it, they they stay in a constant fight or flight realm in their bodies, in their minds. They're constantly looking for the next shoe to fall. They're constantly looking for the next chaos to occur, or they're even creating it. Maybe they're short tempered. Maybe they're annoyed all the time. Maybe they don't like to answer questions because they've had so many questions thrown at them about this situation and they don't know how to deal with it. So, one of the victims is traumatized. The second one could be traumatized as well. Mr. Koberger, I'm sure he's being traumatized in jail as well. And I'm not trying to be a sympathizer, but you know what? He created that trauma. Any kind of trauma that he's experiencing up to this point, unless the jury finds him not guilty, then it's probable cause that he is the perpetrator. So the trauma he's experiencing is going to be lifelong until this trial happens. The parents of all the victims of some kind of trauma, every time they go to the court, every video they watch, every article they have shoved in their face, every new conspiracy theory that they hear about, it reenacts the trauma of their children passing. I'm not trying to add to that trauma. I'm trying to give people information to be able to deal with it so that they know what's going on, what they're experiencing. If and not just them, anybody that watches my videos can be obviously stuck in a trauma bond. They could be stuck in a PTSD form, anything that continues to diminish quality of life. So let's go on with the video.
Person's brain is protecting them. But that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronizing question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
A human response to abnormal events. That was very informative. I hope you got something out of that. There was trauma bonding that was mentioned and that I mentioned. So let's take a look at this really quickly and I'll kind of break down some of what it's talking about. Okay. It says, what do you know about trauma bonding? Have you ever heard of trauma bonding before? In your opinion, what is trauma bonding? So, does the word trauma bonding make you feel uncomfortable or broken inside? Has anyone ever suggested that you might be in an abusive relationship currently or in the past? Well, this is on relationships. So, if you're in a toxic relationship or a friendship or any kind of situational event, which, you know, based on the Idaho 4, it seemed that some of their relationships were not healthy, but I wouldn't say they were trauma bonding. Based on the information that I've learned um, by research, this is just going to teach you a little bit about trauma bonding and what it is and how to get out of it because it affects every area of your life, especially if you have trauma and PTSD at once. You're more apt to bond yourself to high risk people, places, and things and choices. So, what is trauma bonding? Trauma bonding is the attachment an abused person feels toward their abuser. This is seen explicitly in a relationship with a recurrent pattern of abuse. Trauma bonding can occur within families. You can have families that are traumatic that you cannot escape, but you're always bonded to them because of obligation, employment, friendship, business opportunities. Hopefully, nobody ever is held hostage or is human trafficked, or even in the foster care system, it usually begins as a young child. A bond is created when you're unaware of the cycle of abuse and the hidden agenda associated with positive reinforcement after each occurrence of abuse. The abuser will do the following. They'll confess to
that the freeze response needs. We learned about one of them in the 21-day journey, and now you're going to learn about the other one. Time. And you know this. You know this from your experience in the 21-day journey. The freeze response cannot be rushed. Believe me, I've tried for years. If that were successful, I would be the master at it. I have tried every possible way to rush the freeze response, and it just needs time. The other thing that it needs is energy. Why? Why energy? Of all the other things that we could give it, why energy? Because let's trace this back and go back to the stress response. What was going on in the stress response? The stress response was a very active response. For many of us, our nervous system has been trained to go so quickly into the freeze response that some of us don't really even remember what it feels like to sit with the stress of something, right? we think we're stressed and yet we're really overwhelmed. But if we truly are just looking at the stress response, it is a very, very high energy state. It is movement. It is taking action. It is not passive. Passive is the freeze response. I'm just going to let this happen to me. So the stress response is very high energy. Your mitochondria working overtime to give you the energy to actively respond to the stress. And the moment that your body, your autonomic nervous system senses that, hey, we may not have enough energy to fight this danger and overcome, the immediate response is shut down, collapse into the freeze response. Why? Oh, because the freeze response is the conservation of energy rather than the expenditure of energy. And this has now been decided by my body, by the autonomic nervous system, that this is my best strategy for survival. Energy conservation. And so here you've gone from a massive energy expenditure. You can feel the adrenaline, your muscles want to do whatever, right? Tear something apart, for example, right? Like that takes energy. And now you've gone into I'm going to conserve energy because that is the nervous system strategy for your best survival. So as long as it's in this energy conservation state, it wouldn't have even gone into the freeze response yet. The freeze response is the message of overwhelm to the system, an overwhelm of we don't have enough resources for this level of danger, threat, stress. Or remember that the other trigger for the freeze response is too little for too long. And so you've been working with a deficiency of something for too long. And there doesn't need to be any trauma. There doesn't need to be any life event or situation. It's just we've reached that point where we are so depleted that there's nothing left. But even that is an energy issue. So to come out of the freeze response, the system literally has to have the energy to do that. It has to have the sense that I have extra energy now that I can use to come out of the freeze response. Which is why for some people, we talk about this kind of being a journey, right? A journey of their nervous system where they may start always in sympathetic, but then they're going down this journey and now they're starting to go into the freeze response. So now they're doing both. They're going back and forth. And with more time, what happens? Now they're just in the freeze response because they don't have the energy that the system needs to come back out into what will be the sympathetic response or the stress response. The freeze response needs two things: time. Bummer. I hate that. I wish I could give it, bribe it with anything else. Just don't take my time. I've already spent enough time in the freeze response. I don't want to spend more time. What do you mean you just want time? No. It needs time and it needs energy.